Well, thank you, everybody, for lasting the day. I'm delighted to introduce our last speaker, Professor Charles Ludington, who has, I think, travelled the furthest to West Cork from America via France. When I contacted Charles first on the recommendation of Roy Foster, who's always been a great supporter of this festival, he said yes straight away, even though he didn't know anything about us, and agreed to speak. Charles is a wine historian, a professor, and he is currently editing the Bloomsbury Cultural History of Wine, which is a 6-volume encyclopedia, which will be published, I think, in 2025. He has also done some time in UCC, I think. So he does know, sorry? He's done time in UCC. He seems to have survived. And he is going to talk about Irish wine merchants in Bordeaux. So I will hand over to Charles.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Victoria, and thank you and Simon and Roy, who's not here today, for inviting me, and thank all of you for being here. I was, in fact, at UCC from 2015 to 16. I don't remember doing any time, but I had some fun at bars that I may not remember everything that happened. But in any event, a few preliminaries. I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground because I really want to, tell a pretty big story here. So I've decided not to use a text, but mostly just speak from the notes, some of which you'll see in front of you here. Also, I'm doing that for a variety of reasons, because I want to cover a lot of ground. So I'm going to do some generalizations, and we can clarify those or nuance those generalizations in the question and answer time afterwards. Also, one of the reasons that I'm going to have a fair amount of text here is because years ago I went deaf, and through the between ages of 25 and 50. But through the miracle of modern technology, I've regained my hearing with this cochlear implant. But I do recall when I was going deaf and where I had become deaf, spending time at history conferences, trying my best to understand what the speaker was saying. And so now, as a way to make sure that no one experiences that I did, I put a little more text than I probably should on the wall. But anyhow, I hope that helps for anybody who does have a hard time hearing. Lastly, again, I'm going to be speaking in some sweeping terms. I'll give you a lot of detail, but there'll be some sweeping statements, which I acknowledge in advance. But all of this that I'll be talking about, if you have questions, please ask them, but will be coming out in a book whose cover I can't give you because Routledge, has not sent me the exact cover yet, but it'll be coming out in November of this year, called The Irish Community in 18th Century Bordeaux. And Tara McConnell is one of the contributors to that volume. And people like, I wrote the introduction and the concluding chapter. Tara wrote one of the middle chapters. Louis Cullen, a preeminent Irish historian of Franco-Irish connections, as well as Irish economic history, Irish social history, wrote what I think was a phenomenal essay based on his years of work studying Irish colonies in France in particular. French historian named Jean-Pierre Pousseau also contributed. So anyhow, I wish I could sell you advance copies. Routledge didn't do that, but The Irish Community in 18th Century Bordeaux is coming out in November of this year. So off we go with the topic of Irish wine merchants and the invention of modern Bordeaux wines. That's obviously a pretty big claim, but I'll try to back it up in the next 45 minutes. And also, since I have some notes here, and have to do this, we'll go back and forth. Hopefully I'll be able to keep up these two items all at once. So how did this study come about? Well, first of all, as an historian already interested in wine, I wrote a book called The Politics of Wine in Britain, A New Cultural History, which is a study of the political and social and gendered meanings of wine from 1649, that is, at the time when Charles I's head was cut off. One of the last acts that he did as a king was to drink some claret before going to the scaffold, and that was in part to symbolize, in his own mind, his own Christ-like martyrdom. Wine, as a result, especially claret, became a symbol, therefore, of royalists, and wine remained a political I'm using an American term here, although maybe it works here, a political football until the 1860s because of tariff levels and where England was going to purchase its wine from, et cetera, et cetera. So, having done that research about wine, some other questions regarding Ireland emerged. And just to sort of give you my thought processes, the word claret, which is not so much used here as I understand it in Ireland when I was here. I guess they're claret gummies you used to have as children, right? Claret candies, is that correct? So, okay. But of course, the British still use the word claret. We in America say, red Bordeaux wine. But it is it derives from the term claret, the French term claret, which means a clear wine from red grapes. Think of it kind of as a lightly macerated, that is the skins, the red skins don't stay in long contact with the juice. So it's a rosé wine, as it were. That's the origin of the word. And as far as we can tell, given what we know about the maceration and fermentation time, which is really only about 3 days in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, that makes total sense, that the wine was that very light color. So all of this period when England owns Aquitaine, because of the acquisition when Eleanor of Aquitaine brought in her dowry in 1152, when she married Henry II, she brought the territory of Aquitaine and the title of Duke of Aquitaine to her husband. That England's vineyard then became Aquitaine, Bordeaux, the principal one over time. In any event, that became the principal wine for both England as well as for, over time, Scotland, but even more than Scotland, Ireland, given its location more favorable with the trade, for the trade than Scotland. In any event, we know it was a light red wine. We know that also it had to be consumed within the year for some of the reasons that Patricia articulated. That is, it was shipped in barrel, and when it arrived, once you broached that cask, you have to start drinking it fairly quickly. Otherwise, because once you, and remember, as she mentioned, bottles were mostly used as decanters. Over the course of the 18th century, bottles begin to be used for aging wine, but that doesn't really happen until the bottle is cylindrical and can be stored on its side. And that's really, those bottles begin to emerge in England in the second half of the 18th century. And then in fact, it was Pierre Mitchell's son in Bordeaux who copies that English model and then introduces it into France. But they weren't for storing, they weren't for shipping initially, they were just really for decanters. In any event, you ship a wine in a cask. Once you broach that cask, you have to start drinking it pretty quickly because as the wine goes down, the ratio of oxygen to liquid means that the wine is pretty soon going to spoil. Same like a fresh beer if you're drinking it out of a cask. So you have to drink it fairly quickly. The English, the Irish, the Scottish came up with all kinds of ways to try to keep the wines going a little bit longer, but fundamentally the wine would either go bad or it would simply run out by the following, that if the harvest occurs in September, the wine is made, short fermentation, maceration period. It's shipped hopefully in November. There was often a pause for shipping in December and January because of the very poor weather. It was just too dangerous. It would resume in January and February, and then it would continue. By that point, though, most of the wine that was going to be shipped was shipped, but all that wine that arrived in England, Scotland, and Ireland would then be going bad by the following July or so, and then sometimes there was just no more wine left, and you'd wait for the new wine to arrive. So it was a very different idea. So that was the old claret. Some of you may have been to Bordeaux, and you can buy a wine there called Bordeaux Claret. It is a wine that really isn't sold much outside of Bordeaux, and we have some wine merchants from Bordeaux here who would say there's a good reason for that. It's a very light in body and color, and it's kind of one that you go, oh, this is great when you're there and when you're on holiday, and you take it home and you go, I thought this was a great wine when I was there. What happened? Because it was the memory of being there that was so fun. In any event, all this led to my research question: is how did modern Bordeaux become something totally different? In fact, how did it become a luxury good in many people's minds? Although keep in mind, there's a huge range of Bordeaux. There are 5,600 producers of Bordeaux wine. Most of them don't produce a super expensive wine. In fact, they struggle to sell their wine, especially in this day and age when the market's collapsed a little bit and there's an overproduction. But obviously at the upper end, they're selling some of the world's most expensive wines, and certainly in my mind, some of the world's best wines. So how did it become a luxury good is my historical question. And there, oops, sorry, I'm going from there. I told you I'd have to keep up. So producers try to answer that question by saying, let's not look too far into the past. It's always been this way. In other words, they want to naturalize production. The essential marketing idea is Bordeaux wines emerge from the terroir, from the soil itself, and this is simply a product of nature itself with a very delicate touch of the hand of man. And in other words, don't look too far into that question, Mr. Historian, because we'd rather not talk too much about the if we naturalize then it just is. It's kind of like aristocracy. How do these people get to be in charge of everybody else? Well, if you look into that question, you might begin to question their status in the first place, right? So you don't do that. You try to naturalize the alleged inherent superiority of the people on top or the wine itself, and that way people just don't question it. I should also point out, and as I have in the slide here, point out that you see here a bottle, or much of a bottle, of Chateau Margaux. Chateau Margaux was in the 18th century, the only domain, to use a neutral word, that used the word chateau in its in the sales of the wine. Things like Lafite, Latour, they're just known as Lafite, Latour, or Aubryon as Aubryon. Chateau Margaux did actually have a castle, a medieval castle there on the grounds. And then interestingly, in the early 19th century, that castle was raised to create this very famous Neo-Palladian structure, one of the most famous facades in all of Bordeaux. And, but as part of that 19th century branding of Bordeaux, what happens is other domains take this idea of chateau and put it in front as a way to legitimize and, in a sense, give themselves an aura of age also. Who has castles? The aristocracy. What is this wine? It's an aristocratic wine. So they're linking themselves in that way to an aristocratic past. So this is part of Bordeaux's, you might say, branding over time. It's also again, Jane Anson can tell you more about this if you can corner her later on. He's a friend of mine right here. But it's also a bit of a bane in Bordeaux right now. The idea of associating themselves with the aristocracy makes Bordeaux unapproachable to a lot of young wine consumers because of that history of sales in the 19th century. In any event, for historians, that answer that this has just always been the case, when clearly it hasn't always been the case. Claret became claret. So it hasn't always been the case. So it was not ever thus. Here I show you, no, again, sorry, so historians say the answer is no. I've got too much going on in my song and dance here. You can see a bottle of the Claret. So it's sold now as sort of a dark rosé. And then you see next to it a bottle of Chateau Aubryon, which was the prototype. It was the first domain, not known as Chateau at the time, as I just said, which in 1660 tried to launch a new type of darker, fuller-bodied, darker-colored, smoother, those were the terms that were used, wine on the English market. It timed, obviously, with the restoration of Charles II to the court. This court needed luxury products. This was one of the things that was offered. The first record of the name Aubryon comes from Charles II's cellar book 1 month after he was restored to the throne in 1660. So it was launched right for that English market. It took a long time for this type of wine to become the dominant wine in Bordeaux and to displace the wine you see on the left, that is the pink wine, claret. Well, in any event, one early attempt to solve this problem of how did Bordeaux go from claret to claret, famous wine, was by a French historical geographer named Orion Jalbert, who wrote in the famous academic journal Annales in 1953, the creation of quality vineyards has depended more upon the influence of the importers of the wine than upon the actual qualities of the terroir. In other words, what he's saying is, without the London market, there is no Haut-Brion. It's the market that produces by capitalizing the producers into making a better wine. That's how you get these quality products in Bordeaux. And London was that very market. I'm going to be pointing out today that Dublin was also one of those markets. But in any event, you can imagine the response in France. And as I say here, mon Dieu, c'est impossible, les Anglais ont fait ça? That is, no way, this couldn't be the English. So you get a response to that by a French historian in the 1960s who says, no. The greatness of Bordeaux is due to the régisseur, that is the estate manager who oversees the vineyard, decides when to begin harvest, decides how many new barrels versus old barrels to use. And it was the hard work and the attempt of the régisseur to improve the wines. Sure, the market, he needs that market out there because otherwise there's no incentive to improve the wines, but really the credit goes with the régisseur, not with the market himself. So that was one response. Another response in a magisterial dissertation by a French historical geographer named René Pijassou, was published in 1980, says, no, it's the terroir. It really is the soil, especially in the Médoc, that produces these amazing wines. Because first of all, the latitude, it's not too hot, it's not too cold, the grapes have to work really hard, and look at those lovely little, what the French call coupe gravière, these little stony gravel hillocks. And those hillocks, especially when they face south, produce this beautiful wine because Cabernet Sauvignon in particular loves stony soils, and it makes the taproot have to go deep to find water, and the fact that it's a hill means the water mostly drains off, and the fact that it's facing south means the grapes have plenty of chance to get ripe, even if it's not really quite warm enough. Actually, since global warming, Bordeaux has been plenty warm, by the way, but up to about 1982, you have inconsistency in Bordeaux, which is part of the magic of it. When it was, Burgundy's the same way. When in a good year, magnificent. In a poor weather year, not so magnificent. It's kind of unlike, say, Australian wines or Napa Valley wines, which partly, much due to the weather, are fairly consistent because it's always hot in the summer. In any event, those are two responses to Enjalbert's argument that it was really the market that created the wine. Well, first of all, let me just give you a pause there and say the best Bordeaux terroir looks like this, and I put a question mark, which I'll show you in a minute. But that's, when we talk about stony soil, when you go to Château Lafite or Château Mouton up in that little hill just behind Pauillac, as well as at parts of La Tour, and many of the best Bordeaux vineyards really do look like this. Again, especially in the Médoc, or in the Grave. Now, of course, that's the key giveaway, right? The Grave means the gravel. It is a gravelly soil. It's not terribly good for wheat. It is very, very good for wines. And again, much of the soil, especially in the left bank, where Cabernet Sauvignon is the slightly predominant grape over Merlot, comes from that side. Well, again, I said, after thinking about this doesn't add up. Well, why not? First of all, other parts of France have similarly gravelly soils and hot summers, still have gravelly soil, and steeper hills to drain away the rain. And some of the most famous terroirs in Bordeaux, Pomerol, for example, which produces something called Chateau Pétrus, which many of you have probably heard of, which is one of the most expensive Bordeaux wines, does not have much gravel at all in its soil. So is it really all about that particular Médoc soil when that doesn't rain throughout Bordeaux? So that's me saying the terroir argument, it couldn't be just that either. The estate manager argument. The estate manager did oversee the vineyard work. He sold the wine within weeks. So we think of en primeur wines. The en primeur season is April, right? In April, after the harvest is usually, these days it could be early as August, but think of August, September, maybe a little bit of October. The following April, the wines are exhibited to customers who can buy early versions of the wine based on what they think the wine will become. Pro tip, and again, Jane can correct me, but 2022 is thought to be a remarkably good year. But of course, given global warming, there have been a lot of remarkably good years recently. In any event, these wines in the 18th century, when wine I knew was undergoing this transformation, they were sold within weeks or a few months. If the régisseur was unlucky, he couldn't sell his wines until after Christmas. But his goal was to sell the wines before Christmas. That is, he wanted a quick return on his investment. That's because he needed to pay his employers. The property owner, who is usually a noblesse de robe, that is an aristocrat of the robe who had, not of the sword, a new aristocrat, wanted also a return on his investment, his property investment. Moreover, the régisseur had no knowledge of foreign markets. And finally, there were no warehouses or places to age the wine at the chateau at the time. In fact, very often there were no chateaux themselves. It was what we would call farmsteadings, and all for a quick fermentation process, and then you would hopefully sell your wine right away to merchants. So here's again, I said the argument doesn't add up, the arguments that have been put forward by other historians, and so I kept digging. On the other hand, Bordeaux in the 18th century, that is the century when this wine gets transformed, we know about what the role of merchants was. I'm going to use the term merchants négociants, both. They purchased the wine, often with the help of brokers, that is putting people in touch. I want this much wine, he has that much wine, you two should meet, and taking a cut. The négociants purchased the wine from the property owners, often with the help of brokers. They had, as merchants, ready cash. They knew the foreign markets because they often came from foreign countries. They also rented or owned riverfront warehouses for raising the wine. So one way to think of the négociant in the 18th century, during this period of transformation, is what the French called négociants éleveurs. You get those, I think, more in Burgundy these days than you do in Bordeaux, because in Bordeaux, it's the chateaux themselves that make the wine, age the wine, bottle the wine, and then sell the wine. But in the 18th century, it was the merchant who was in many ways the winemaker, because if you ferment your wine and macerate it for 3 days, you get this light-colored wine, and then you sell it on, it's not yet ready for market, especially not for consumers who want more than a light pink wine. So it was the merchants who were really creating this new wine in the 18th century. So where do we go from there? A brief pause to say this is a illustration from the 18th century of the busy Quai des Chartrons. Patricia alluded to the Chartrons neighborhood earlier, but it's just on the north side of the old city, heading out toward the Atlantic, just beyond what was used to be the old castle grounds, which the French had erected against, well, first the English, then the French, against possible English or Dutch invasion on the north side of the city. That is, boats coming in from the sea would have to pass that castle first. Beyond that was the mercantile area, especially foreign merchants were required to live there. So you see how wines would come in, wines would either come or go from the big boats onto the small skiffs, rolled ashore, into the warehouses, and then when they were ready to be sold, they rolled back out onto the big boats, off they would go into the Atlantic. So, and remember, all this starts because England had once owned Aquitaine as part of Eleanor's dowry. And that is a tradition then. In other words, the whole thing could have just died, as it were, once England lost the 100 Years' War, but the taste for those wines was still there, and the desire of merchants to sell their wines, that is to keep their livelihood going by continuing to be winemakers, continued. Well, my argument then, and again, you can see probably more text than you want, but for those who are like me, hard of hearing, you get to see the whole thing here. So Bordeaux wine was transformed into a luxury product during the long 18th century. because of a wealthy English market that demanded a discernibly superior wine with more body and color, because estate managers worked very hard to make a superior en primeur, that is young wine, knowing that it would make a greater profit, because the best terroirs were extremely favorable to making outstanding wines, and because of, and I think you know where I'm going here, Irish merchants. Okay, now I'm going to explain that. But let me just go back because I realized I didn't give you enough detail on why did the English want a different kind of wine? Well, very briefly, you can read my book called The Politics of Wine in Britain, A New Cultural History. But fundamentally what happens between 1678 and 1697, in a series of tariff wars and actual wars, the English and the French went at it. First, the French under Colbert, who was Louis XIV's finance minister, of Scottish ancestry, by the way, increased the French tariff on English cloth as a way to try to protect the French cloth industry, which couldn't compete in quality with English cloth. So he said, we'll just keep it out by raising the price, and that way people will be forced to buy French cloth. There was a lot of smuggling, it didn't really entirely work. The English said, uh-oh, we're angry now. Parliament, not the king, is in charge of taxation. So in 1678, the English Parliament, against Charles II's wishes, slaps a tax on French wines, which at that time were the least taxed wines. And it bumps up the price. Then you have a war that begins in 1688-89, which you know about here in Ireland, of course. You see an actual embargo of French wines. But the point is, by 1697, French wines had gone from the least taxed to the most taxed in England. So what that meant was that English consumers, if they're going to buy French wine, want a wine that is worth the while to pay that flat tax, because the flat tax was going to be there no matter the quality of the wine. So this incentivizes the Bordeaux winemakers and the négociants to try to make a wine that imitated that prototype made by Haut-Brion. Does that make any sense? Any following all that? So in other words, their incentive, that's why the English, it also ties into the fact that in 1689, broadly speaking, with the replacement of James II, the Catholic king who was kicked off the throne, and by William of Orange, who becomes William III, and his wife, Mary, who happened to be, by the way, Mary, of course, is James's daughter, and William, this is always fascinating, is James's son-in-law, obviously, but also his nephew. So Mary and William were kissing cousins, obviously. More than that, excuse me. Anyway, they were married, and they replace James. But with that, there's a broad shift in regime, not only in terms of the government, but in terms of the elite social class in England moves more from the aristocratic, the Tory side. We've already seen by that point the emergence of the Tory party, same one in many ways. They were the conservatives, by a new, more mercantile elite who favored the Dutch king, because by golly, those Dutch are really good at one thing, trading stuff. They know how to do commerce. So this new party called the Whigs really likes them. And they're a mixture of aristocrats as well as new money merchants. But if you're a new money merchant and you're trying to justify your position, or let me back up. If you're an aristocrat and you say, why am I here in charge of everybody in the room? Well, I'm the Duke of Mucky-Muck. And you would all go, well, of course that's the reason you're in charge. Remember we talked about naturalizing power? You are an aristocrat. You are the aristoi, the Greek, the best. You rule over us. And don't think about why, just think that, no, I'm the best. God put me here was the excuse, right? That was the way people justified it then. But if you don't have that background, you need to be able to show people why it is that you are ruling over them. Aesthetics become that way. Taste becomes the way for the Whigs, those merchants who don't have the ancestral aristocratic background to say, the reason I'm here ruling over you is because I have taste. And taste gets linked, as it still does to this day, to morality. He has bad taste. Maybe he's also kind of immoral. People who have good taste, as the elite in society set the rules for what that means, must therefore also be moral. That link goes back. way back. And certainly at this point, it's the merchants who seize on this. So taste, they have an extra incentive to drink wine that exhibits their taste because they don't have the aristocratic background. That was a long aside to tell you why those English wanted that new kind of wine. But anyhow, back to these Irish merchants, who I am arguing were one of the reasons Bordeaux, along with terroir, along with the English market, along with the régisseur, the estate manager, are responsible for this transformation. Well, here we go here. What was the Irish merchants' role? Well, they made wines to fulfill the demands of the Irish and British markets. We'll talk more about the Irish market in a minute. The English in particular wanted a wine that was worth paying all those high taxes on, for the reasons I just elaborated. And all of these people wanted a discernibly superior wine, which, to use their words, they were not very flowery words. There was no Robert Parker at the time talking about all kinds of flowers and fruits and tar on the road and woodland, etc. But basically, it was very simple. Full-bodied, smooth, and dark-colored. In other words, not the old claret. We want something different. And so the Irish merchants obliged them, and they transformed traditional claret into a very different wine. This was a process, though, that took place throughout the 18th century. It wasn't an event that occurred overnight, even if some estates, like Aubryon, and by 1705, we see the names Margaux, Latour, Lafitte, the four first growths in the 1855 classification, which in 1973 were joined by Chateau Mouton. But in any event, those names, not Mouton, which was known as Brun at the time, but the other four already emerged on the English market among the elites in the first decade of the 18th century to join Aubryon. Well, why were Irish merchants so prominent? And here we go. Again, here I'm going to, this is based on a lot of conversations with Louis Cullen, a lot of reading of his works, and other Irish scholars, including David Dixon, who's here. There were push factors, but broadly speaking, war, religious intolerance had obviously impacted the Irish economy, hindered it quite badly, so it wasn't as developed. It stayed more agrarian for a variety of reasons. Then, of course, there was the political unrest. We see the penal laws against Catholics, which begin 1692, again, there's some arguments about when exactly the first one was, when the last one was, et cetera, when they were fully removed. But broadly, 1692, with an all-Protestant Irish parliament. This is, again, a year after the Treaty of Limerick, you can see, till about 1715, when those very clearly make Catholics in Ireland second-class citizens in their own country. And then you have things like the Wool Act of 1699, which was, you might say, understandably placed by an English parliament in order to protect its own woolen industry, which is a source of its own wealth. And just as the French were trying to protect their cloth industry from the English were trying to protect their cloth industry, especially the raw and unfinished wool, from the Irish producers who could undersell them. Why? Because the cost of land in Ireland was less. So consequently, getting wool from Ireland or cloth made in Ireland was cheaper than English wool, and so the English erected a tariff barrier in 1699, and this harmed the economic possibilities of Irish landowners who, because of the land changes or usurpations of the 17th century, had gone from being mostly Catholic at the beginning of the century to mostly Protestant by the end of the century. So my point being, the economic outlook and prospects for ambitious young Irishmen, and I'm using the term men here carefully because it was mostly a gendered thing, were limited on both sides, especially for Catholics, but also for Protestants in some ways. So there are relatively few commercial opportunities for ambitious but unlanded Irishmen of any faith, so they went to countries where the economies were more developed if they sought economic and social improvement through commerce. One of those places, of course, was France. You know what? So I summarized that now because I didn't keep up. Everything I just said, you know already. But I apologize for those who I'm trying to, for those who need the assistance of the writing. All the arguments are there. But the basic idea is that the economic prospects, again, for Irish men was not that great. Well, those were push factors. Again, religious bigotry as well, et cetera, et cetera. But there were also pull factors. As in many more agrarian European societies, the elites consumed and served much wine. Why? Well, you can go back to the Gaelic chieftains, who were, of course, condemned by the English, who come over starting in the 12th century and continue, of course, under the Tudors, much more aggressively so, who condemn the Gaelic chieftains, but then are accused by the English of doing the very same thing themselves, of behaving in this way where they're drinking too much wine and serving too much wine. Broadly speaking, the belief is this was both a gesture of magnanimity. Who else can serve this much wine? Do you have that kind of power? So I'm going to serve you a lot of wine as a way to assert my power over you, because you can't return that favor. Secondly, as Patricia talked about, it was a sign of masculinity too, to be able to drink a lot of wine, handle that wine, or at least get up the next day and function half well. So for those reasons, there was a great deal of demand in Ireland. Just to give you a very famous quote from Lord Chesterfield, who of course was an Englishman, but Lord Lieutenant of Ireland for 2 years in the mid-century. In Ireland, claret ruined the constitutions, the faculties, and too often the fortunes of those of superior rank. So we do know there was a great deal of drinking. Of course, there were respites between. We can romanticize that, but nevertheless, there was a great deal of drinking in Ireland during the 18th century, much of which has been written about by both Patricia and Tara as well. So you have a strong demand in Ireland. You also have favorable taxation. These may be too small as I see now, but the basic idea, compared to British tariffs, which were made uniform in 1707 due to the Union, that is, the Scots were angry at the fact that they now had to pay the English tariff rate because of the Union. Their response, as I mentioned in previous comments, was to import wine from France, which was kind of a way to say up you to the English, because remember the old alliance. So they're drinking wine from the old enemy, from England's old enemy, their old friend in the old alliance, but they're calling it Spanish or Portuguese, and thereby paying a lesser rate. That was the Scottish trick. And mostly that was inexpensive Bordeaux wine. So, in any event, but that changes as the century goes on. The Scots begin to drink. So it gets more nuanced than that. By the second half of the 18th century, the Scots are drinking, beginning to imitate English consumers more and drink better quality. Plus the customs authorities are trying to cut down on fraudulent declarations, et cetera. But you can see here, just to give you some idea, Irish customs per ton of wine, 252 gallons, 10 pounds tax on a ton of wine in 1707. And meanwhile, for British tax, it's 54 pounds. So a significant tariff difference. You can see the figures there. That remains true throughout the 18th, even into the 19th century, even post-1823, when in theory, tariffs were equalized between Britain and Ireland, because they were part of this new thing called the United Kingdom as of 1801. But unlike what happened in Scotland in 1801, Irish tariffs did not immediately go to the British rate in 1801. In any event, that made claret cheaper in Ireland. So another reason for strong demand in Ireland. Just a little aside, you see that some of you are probably saying, but the Irish pound and the English pound weren't the same. The ratio was broadly 13 to 12, so it's an 8% difference, not terribly significant given the huge significance of the tariff rates. So, I know it's a little bit hokey to have the fake leprechaun hat. I get that, I apologize. But Britain and Ireland were a small share of Bordeaux's export market. From circa 1713 to 85, Ireland always imported more wine from Bordeaux than all of Britain. But Irish merchants also had access to the British market, which of course was larger and wealthier. So again, these are statistics that Patricia used. They were first made by a man named Paul Butel, and then Stephen Murphy put them in his book. But broadly speaking, in 1768, of of around 75,000 tons. Again, these are all notional. When any time an historian uses figures and they're all zeros at the end, those are notional. You know, statistics, customs books never end that way. My God, everything always ends in zeros every year. No, in other words, these are rounded up or down to the closest 1,000. Anyhow, 1,000 tons to England and Scotland, 6,000 to Ireland, 20,000 to the Caribbean, mostly, although also to some other French colonies, but broadly speaking to the Caribbean, which was what the French had left by 1768, and then 48,000 tons to northern France, to Brittany, to Poitou, to Picardy, and to northern Europe, especially the German-speaking lands of northern Europe. Ports like Hamburg and Danzig, Lübeck were huge importers of Bordeaux wine. Well, the key, though, is there was a qualitative difference. The average price per ton of exported wine to London was around 1,500 livres tournois. That was the French currency of the day. The rest of England around 800 livres tournois. Scotland around 600 livres tournois. Ireland around 400. So Ireland, as I mentioned before, was both a luxury market, so these are averages, as well as a mass market. Remember, because of Ireland's low tariff rate. Meanwhile, you can tell all of those are among Bordeaux's better wines, or best wines, because the average price for wines going to northern France and northern Europe was a mere 200 livres tournois. In other words, the Irish and the British were drinking the best stuff, and London in particular was drinking good stuff. Well, why else were the Irish so involved in this trade? Bordeaux was welcoming. It was welcoming, especially welcoming to Irish Catholics, because there had been a Catholic seminary in Bordeaux going back to 1603. So Irish merchants, Irish Catholic merchants could go there, and they would actually have Irish seminarians as well as Irish priests. So they could have Mass, and they did, with Irish priests. There were seminarians as part of that going back and forth. They were also going to a kingdom where Catholics were not second-class citizens. In fact, in 1685, they would very clearly be first-class citizens, because the French would impose on, the French government would impose on French Protestants some of the same, even more draconian rules against Protestants that the Irish government, Irish Anglican and Protestant government, had imposed against Irish Catholics. And I say more draconian because basically they said, you can't even be here, you have to leave. That is, they kicked the Huguenots out, officially. Meanwhile, the Bordeaux merchant community was actually quite cosmopolitan by early modern standards. It included Huguenots. Well, I just said they were kicked out, but hold on here. German Lutherans, another type of Protestant, Sephardic Jews who had left Portugal and come to Bordeaux. And in that environment, Irish Protestants felt safe. Well, I just said the Huguenots were kicked out. Not exactly, because in places like Bordeaux, where there's a concentration of them, they tended to come together as merchants because they weren't allowed to enter some of the professions as Protestants. They weren't allowed to rise up in the administration or in the army, et cetera. And so they specialized in commerce, and as a result, they were good to tax. So you didn't want to kick out all of your Protestants in France because you're shooting yourself in the foot if you're the French government. So that's why there were some, even though they were technically there illegally. Well, the point is, Irish of both Catholic and Protestant faiths were welcome in Bordeaux. Becoming a wine merchant in Ireland also, whichever end of the trade you were on, and very often Irish merchants who went to Bordeaux would come back and or maybe go a few times in their lives, was also a social step up. So to quote the Englishman Edward Wakefield in his account of Ireland, Statistical and Political in 1812, the higher ranks in Ireland considered tradesmen as a distinct class in society, and every business is condemned, that of wine merchant excepted. So being a wine merchant was a social step up. So another reason, another pull factor, you might say, to Bordeaux. And then, crucially, Ireland produced things the French wanted in return for wine. I won't go on about this because you've been hearing about this in two wonderful lectures earlier, but crucially, they had something to make the trade viable. That is, the boats never went empty in any direction. Your trade collapses pretty quickly if that's the case. If all you're carrying is rocks for ballast, it's probably not going to work. But because Ireland offered France something the French wanted, and because in many ways to the French, the Irish were the acceptable face of the British king, because the French had an inkling that a lot of people in Ireland don't really like the British that much either. And so they're okay, we agree, even though they had the same king. So in any event, it was salt beef in particular that the Irish had that the French wanted. Other things, butter, tallow. Daniel Lynch, who went over in 1698, started off as a tallow merchant. He is the founder of Lynch Bage. In any event, salt beef was the big item for reasons discussed earlier, because most of that went from Ireland, especially from Cork, down to Bordeaux, and then it was re-exported to Haiti, or Santo Domingo, Haiti, because that was the primary source of protein for the enslaved Africans who were working to death to produce the sugar that in many ways, ironically, when you go to, if anybody been to Bordeaux, if you raise a hand, anybody, so if you walk around, you see this beautiful 18th century city, and you think, God, wine's been so good to this city. But all the Allées de Tourny and all of that, those parts, the Cours de Verdun, the Jardin Public, all those areas, that was essentially West Indian sugar, indigo, coffee money. The wine money was there, but it's mostly out in the countryside. What really built the 18th century face of Bordeaux was this Caribbean trade, and in particular, the trade in salt beef. There were some slaving vessels that began in Bordeaux, although it was Kate who said it and pointed out that Nantes was really the center of the French trade in human beings. So, for all these push and pull factors, off the Irish went. This is just a list of all the different, or no, not nearly all, many of the different names. They were ultimately, at its peak in 1756, there were roughly 260 to 280 Irish people living in Bordeaux. That includes the seminarians and the priests at the Irish College. But mostly it was merchants, and most of those merchants and their families. That 260 to 280 Irish people in Bordeaux was roughly 1/3 Protestant and 2/3 Catholic, obviously. And we'll talk more about their interactions, which were famously quite good, or perhaps ironically quite good in the 18th century, given the context. But that made that the largest Irish colony outside of Britain, larger than the second largest one of Cadiz in Spain, which had a larger volume of trade, but fewer Irish people living there. But Cadiz in Spain, also a source of wine, sherry, was the second largest of those colonies. Again, you see many of the names here. You recognize some of them. We'll talk more about a few of them in a minute. But off they went. Of the 280 or so British nationals in Bordeaux, that was the French government term, plus they themselves referred to their community as the British factory. That is, they might say, I am Irish, or I'm English, or I'm Scottish, but the factory, that is the group of factors who came together, called themselves the British factory. And they were over 80% Irish. So they dominated trade of the best properties. To give you an example, old Will Barton, this is the son of Thomas Barton, who was the first Barton to go over, surprised the great ones. He bought up every drop of Lafitte, Latour, Aubryon, and Kirwan's, that's his misspelling, but what we today call Chateau Kirwan. That was actually named after an Irish family from Galway, the Kirwans. In any event, again, I can defer to some of the people in the wine trade here tonight, but the idea that one négociant purchases every single drop of Lafitte, Latour, and Aubryon could never happen in this day. It could never happen, nothing close like that. But that was the kind of dominance that the Irish had, and this year, obviously, that the Barton family had. We'll be tasting some of this wine, I believe, or maybe it's Longo à Barton in a few minutes. So briefly talk about some of the success stories that are linked to some of the wines we'll be tasting tonight. On the left, you see Thomas Barton, known as French Tom. He was from County Fermanagh, just on the border of Donegal. He was a Protestant from a merchant family. He left France in 1721, left Ireland in 1721, settled in Bordeaux in 1725, and did quite well for himself, so much so by 1751 he achieved his goal of buying a big house back in Ireland. It happened to be in Feathered, County Tipperary, and that was in 1751. But rather than stay there, he really liked working in Bordeaux, and he didn't trust his son to run the business, so he set up his son as an Irish gentleman in Tipperary, and he went back to Bordeaux where he ran the business and continued to be prosperous. The story goes on from there, but in many ways it was really his grandson. William Barton was the one I just referred to. His son was the one who bought all the Kirwan and the Lafitte, Latour, etc., Margaux in 1788. This man died in 1780. In any event, it was his grandson, Hugh, who really went big, who had to leave. He was imprisoned by the French revolutionaries in 1793 during the Terror. He fled with his French-born Irish wife, Anna Johnston, whose family had come from County Armagh and Dublin. During the Terror, having been arrested but let out, he flees France. But before going, he sets up a business with a guy named Guestier, and that's the origins of B&G, Barton and Guestier. He then said, I'll handle things on the Dublin end, you stay here in Bordeaux, handle things on the French end. And they continued that partnership during the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, when once again Barton had to leave. He went back to Ireland, ran things from the Dublin end, where Guestier ran things from the Bordeaux end. After the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815, he went back to France and bought a property in Saint-Julien called Langoa-Barton, or named after himself, as often does, Langoa-Barton, and then in 1825 purchased part of the Léoville property, it just happens to be adjacent, making Léoville-Barton. This made him so much money, and he continued to do so well, that he moved back to Ireland, at this point to Kildare, that is, he's going up Fermanagh, Tipperary, now Kildare, where in Straffan, getting closer to Dublin, he has enough money to buy himself a really big house. He becomes the sheriff of Kildare. That house is today known as the K Club. So if you want to see a really big house that wine money can produce, or did produce, that would be the K Club. In any event, on the right is Dennis McCarthy. This is a new portrait acquired by the National Gallery of Ireland. So on the left, that was Barton. Thank you for the cues. That was Barton I was talking about, on the left. On the right is Dennis McCarthy in a new portrait purchased by the National Gallery of Ireland in 2021. In any event, he arrived in Bordeaux in 1748, and he and his wife had a daughter, not a son, but she died at age 20. Because he had no sons, it probably wouldn't have mattered if he had only had daughters, given the patriarchal nature of things. But she died at age 20 in 1776 anyway. In any event, he worked his way up the social scale. That is, by 1756, he had convinced the French government that he was descended from the McCarthys of Carbery and the McCarthy Rays of Carbery. He was ennobled. He got his noble status. He then asked his nephews, two nephews from Tipperary, to come to Bordeaux to take on the business or to apprentice and then take it over, because he only had a daughter who he presumably would marry off. She ended up dying, as I said, in 1776. In any event, what happened was they did very well. They also became ennobled because of their same family status. A very bad time in France to gain noble status, because in 1789, it doesn't look very good. Of those two nephews, one had to flee during the Terror. He went to Hamburg. Another one died mysteriously in prison. And Dennis McCarthy was considered too old to harass. He ended up dying in 1796. But his family did spectacularly well in the wine trade too. Because he had no male issue and his female issue died, it was one of the sons of John McCarthy, Daniel and John were the two nephews, who in 1828 purchased what is now known as Chateau Au Marbuzet, the second wine of which is known as Chateau McCarthy, because of that link. It's also important to say that McCarthy, he was a Patrick McCarthy, he married Georgina Lawton, who was descended from Abraham Lawton from Cork, and that's the only known Protestant Catholic marriage that I know of among this community. Otherwise, they were often very, very close. They went into business together. They worked for each other as commissioners, as clerks, etc. But married together, they did not, for the most part. In any event, success story, business fortunes. On the left, you see a house that the McCarthys bought next to the Jardin Public. On the left, you see the house. Thank you. On the left, you see the house that the McCarthys bought. It abuts the Jardin Public. The family crest is actually facing the public garden in Bordeaux. It's the first house. Again, so it's both this side is on the Cour de Verdun, and the north-facing side is actually on the inside the garden itself. On the right-hand side, you see a house built by and inhabited by the Lawton family. Again, Abraham Lawton went over in 1738 as a merchant, but quickly said, being a broker is going to make me more money. So he changed from being a merchant, a négociant, into a broker. He did well. The Lawton family is still there. The McCarthy name died out in 1930. The Lawton name is still there, and members of the family still run a brokerage business called Testé et Loto, as the French pronounce it, but Lawton from Cork. Business failures. I don't want to over-romanticize things and tell you it was all money for everybody. Especially during the War of American Independence, you see bankruptcies, you see businesses going closing entirely. That is, bankruptcies, people could often renegotiate their debt, restructure their debt and stay in business. But my point is, because of all the Anglo-Irish wars, and the Anglo-French wars, which of course the Irish were involved in as subjects of the British king, it was a difficult time to be in business. It wasn't easy to make this money. There was a lot of demand, so if you could get your wine to market, it could be good. You could make money. But it was a difficult time given all the wars between Britain and France, because those included everybody. I should also point out in 1756, the King of France delivered an edict expelling all of the subjects of King George II. This was a revenge for what the British had done to the Acadians in what we today call Nova Scotia, who were forced to leave Acadia, which is eastern Canada, and go down the St. Lawrence River, down the Mississippi, where they ultimately settled in Louisiana. And we know them today as Cajuns. But the French king said all the British subjects have to go. That included the Irish. Luckily, the Irish pulled out their "I'm persecuted back home," or "I'm a Jacobite," or "I make a whole lot of money for you, please don't kick me out" card. And almost all of them were allowed to stay. So, moving on from there into the archives, and I realize we need to wrap things up. Won't go on for long, but just wanted to show you some of the names. James Clark from Dromontin, the French name has now been Francicized to Dromontin. It's actually a little village in County Down called Dromontine. So Patrick de Dromontin, his family also got ennobled. It sounds very noble. You go to Dromontine in County Down, you're like, wow. Christopher Jernan, as he pronounced it, those were both Catholics. These are the ledger books of Abraham Lawton, who actually married a French Catholic woman in Bordeaux, and in 1756 insisted that he was Protestant, his wife was Catholic, but they were raising the kids Catholic. The parish priest liked the family so much that he went along with that, even though the children were in fact all being raised Protestants. The Lawton family to this day continues to be a prominent family at the temple of the Rue du A in Bordeaux. But one of the key things about the Lawton books, to show you just how much business was going, there was real, and in the letters and the testimonies, Barton referred to Dennis McCarthy as an intimate friend. He sent him this very teary letter when his daughter died. People went into business together, as I said. Hennessy referred to everybody, because Richard Hennessy of cognac fame actually lived most of his time in France in Bordeaux. Between 1776 and 96, he lived in Bordeaux. He referred to everybody there as my countrymen. So you get a very interesting attitude that seems to take place in France, because to the French, of course, we don't know that they're all Irish, right? That was their attitude. And so they come together because they're in the same business. there after the same markets, there were some distinctions of who dominated what market. Protestants dominated the Dublin market, Catholics more the Limerick and Galway market, et cetera. But again, you see these names, Galway, Ainsley was actually Scottish, but Harford, Sandilands was of Scottish Presbyterian background, but it made his way to Dublin. The Blacks were Belfast Presbyterians, but again, Galways were Catholic, blah, blah, blah. You see the ways they worked together in terms of buying wines from each other. So often Lawton was doing deals between Irish merchants as friends. That's why he said, good idea to be a broker, because I know this guy, he's got this much wine in his cellar, and this guy wants that much wine. These are all my Irish friends. He makes a fortune off of that. Bern, Dillon, you can get Chateau Dillon, as the French pronounce it, Chateau Dillon, made by the wine school in Blanquefort, just north of Bordeaux to this very day. You see Kirwan here, the family name before it was Thomas Lynch of Lynch-Bage fame. On the right, I just wanted to show you this. Bern sold, I've done it again. Working together, buying from countrymen. Okay, going back to that, I'm sorry. I don't usually, so going back here, working together, that's where you get, you see Byrne and Jernan and Dillon. You see Black and Sandilands and Jernan and Galway and Johnston, a family that is still there also today in Bordeaux. So again, apologies. Now we're moving on to the next one. Buying from countrymen. Connor bought of Kirwan. So here is Lawton, an Irishman, doing a deal between two Irishmen. And you see Connor bought of Thomas Lynch. That, of course, is the family that owned Lynch-Bage in Pauillac. I offer the slide on the right just because it's an interesting name. When I was going across it, I'm like, what is this interesting name? It kind of looks familiar. Byrne bought of Guillotin. Well, who is this guy, Guillotin? So I do some research. He happened to teach philosophy at the Irish College. This actually was his father, not him himself, but the son. So the proprietor, the vineyard owner, was the father here, buying, who sold wine to Byrne through Lawton. That's this guy here. His son taught philosophy at the Irish College, the seminarians. His son also won the contest for inventing a machine that could lop people's heads off in the most humanely possible way. And anyhow, all these things. And again, he had that very man, the inventor of the guillotine, had been a teacher at the Irish College in Bordeaux. His father was a vineyard owner and winemaker. So moving on without blending, very briefly, you can read all about this in the last chapter of the book that's coming out, or an article by me in the global history of food. But broadly speaking, one of the things that was going on, there's also a podcast on Jane Anson's website in which Jane and I talk about how this wine was being made, but because of time, very briefly, every year, regardless of the quality, in order to make this wine richer, smoother, fuller bodied, darker in color, as that discerning clientele demand, you start with a superior quality base wine. You buy Lafite, you buy Latour, you buy Aubryon, but that wasn't good enough just yet. How do you make it even better for that market that wants more richness and color? You blend in, you cut it with, depending on the year, up to about 20% of wine from the Rhone Valley, Hermitage in particular, which is the sort of the mecca of Syrah. And then you buy wine from Spain, in particular, what they called Benicarlo, which comes from just south of Barcelona, which is kind of the home of the Grenache grape. And then you buy wine from farther down the coast near Alicante, which is the home of the Mourvèdre, or what the Spanish call the Monastrell grape. You put those together according to what you want, anywhere between 15 and 20% of the total blend. You take some sweet wine from Sauternes, but some sweet juice from Sauternes that hasn't been fermented yet, so it's full of sugar. That recommences fermentation, which thereby blends these wines together so that it doesn't taste like you're just doing this to your wine and handing someone a bottle, a glass. And in this way, they achieve this flavor profile that this discerning audience and consumers wanted, both in England, but also in Ireland. Well, what I want to I can answer more questions about that later on, but I really want to end up, because I know we have to get on to the tasting. The key point of this is by the 1780s, this transformation has occurred. Most Bordeaux at this point, leaving Bordeaux at least, was no longer claret, it was now claret. It had become something akin to what we would think of. I don't want to project too much back onto that was the moment. It was modern Bordeaux wine. No, because wine techniques continue to change. Winemaking techniques continue to change. Grape blends continue to change. In the 18th century, at least the first part, Petit Verdot was probably the most common grape. By the second half of the century, you see the emergence of Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. So was it exactly our wine? No. But my argument is, by the 1780s, you see what we would think of as modern Bordeaux. And as I've tried to argue, a key component of that was Irish merchants. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you. That was, wow, what a tour de force in my bad French. There's time for a couple of questions, if anyone has one. Right at the back there. Do we have a mic?
We have a microphone.
Simon, right at the
Bookseller.
yeah.
Thank you for that. It's a point of information rather than a question that across the river in the parish of Haffadown, there was a Lawton family, and they always claimed, or it was always claimed, they were related to the Lawtons. I don't know whether it's true or not.
That I don't know. Sorry, yeah, that I don't know. I think my understanding, according to the information from the Lawton family that I did in Bordeaux, was the family had come to Ireland as part of the Tudor conquest in the 16th century, and they settled in Cork, but then they actually down the River Lee, as well as I think the one who went to Bordeaux, Abraham, was from Loch Mahon, or somewhere. He had his house was so just east of the city. But you know how much. I'm sure there was marriage going on that brought in other elements of the family. But according to the family, they came from England to Ireland in the 1500s. But again, yeah, people marry a lot.
As a French Huguenot, may I suggest that you look into the travelling of the wild geese, because the change of the colour of the Bordeaux wine was the way the Irish got back at the English.
There's some wonderful works on French Huguenots, as you probably know, by the way. Yeah.
Did I understand you to say that the origins of Grenache and Mourvedre actually come from Garnacha and Monastrell?
So the origins of
Grenache and Mourvedre wines come from Garnacha and Monastrell.
Yes, they're both Spanish grapes. They're Spanish grapes. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah. I'm sorry if that wasn't clear. So that's what I'm saying. The blend that was taking place, they referred to it as Hermitage. They didn't call it Syrah, but by law, red Hermitage is Syrah. The northeastern Spain is where the Grenache grape comes from, and the southeastern Spain is the home of the Monastrell. So what's interesting is some of you have probably had bottles of wine that say GSM on them, or if you have a Côte du Rhône or a Châteauneuf-du-Pape, you're probably getting a GSM. That is Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre. But of course, in this case, it's meant to fill out the Bordeaux wine to give it, again, that little extra oomph, a little extra color. And why? Again, because the Rhône Valley and eastern Spain are warmer than Bordeaux. So what you're going to get is richer, riper grapes. Now, in the 19th century, when you begin to see a turn away from this idea of that blending is not, because in the papers that I look at, you get merchants in Ireland and England saying, don't send us any of that uncut stuff. We don't want that. And then you tell people that in this day and age, they go, well, they must have known it was blended, it was a fraud. No, they wanted that. They didn't think of it as a fraud. But in the second half of the 19th century, you begin to see this desire for purity based on a lot of reasons. I have some theories that are a little bit outlandish, but the big one is probably the clearest reason is that because of Oidium and phylloxera, so many vines are destroyed that production simply can't meet demand. So people really are beginning to bring wines in from particular places farther than and they're blending much more. So the degree of blending is much more. People also become much more aware. There's all kinds of food scares and scares about tea, whether it's really tea or sawdust that's been colored, because people's knowledge of chemistry and biology is increasing. Another aspect of one of my own theories is that one of the big replacements happens to be Algerian wine by that point. And there you get second half of 19th century conceptions of race, which we today don't really think about much, but of course they culminated in the disaster of the 1930s. But scientists at respectable institutions and respectable human beings really took this race idea seriously. And the idea that you're bringing grapes in from Africa and you're putting them in our French wines? I think this is one of the reasons that people said, no, we want to know this comes from where it says. And so you see this rejection of blending, far from being demanded, it's rejected. And by the 1930s, the French passed laws that say, if you do this, you go to jail. Of course, we know that every once in a while, the French are still blending their wines, and we're horrified. And yet it's kind of ironic because the 18th century Irish would have said, yeah, but does it taste better? If it tastes better, that's the wine you want.
Thanks for a great talk. Can you just tell us, in the transformation that you've been talking about in the 18th century, does aging of wine play a part? And putting it differently, when does the idea that the hierarchy of wines is determined by the length of time that they've aged come into play?
That the hierarchy within Bordeaux?
Yeah, well, yes. The idea that the older the wine, the longer it's aged, then the finer it's likely to be.
So it's the winery itself that does the...
When does the aging of wine come in as part of the making of wine?
The aging point, but I'm hearing you. I'm saying, but the aging point, as in the chateau doing the wine, or
whoever, but whoever the value placed on the idea of the maturing wine, of leaving it to age.
One of the fascinating things in Lawton's books, for example, in 1815. Guillaume Lawton, as they say, the son of Abraham from Cork, so he was half Irish and half French. He wrote a book to hand on to his son of everything I've ever learned, basically, in this business as a broker. And when he refers to Aubryon and Latour and Lafite, he says that these wines should be aged, he's talking about in barrel at this point, for 5 to 7 years. Which is now obviously much longer, mostly 18 months, 24 months for the very top wines, a little bit less often for lesser wines. So as I imagine those wines, and at that point though, by 1815, they would have then been bottled. But I imagine them to taste a little bit like, again, maybe I'm being a wine geek here, but if you ever had sort of a dusty old Rioja, it tastes a little bit like dust, quite literally. It's still got some nice fruit in it, but I suspect that's probably where what was going on a little bit. But they also had no qualms of saying just before, you ate, the bulk of it might age for 5-7 years, but before we ship it off, let's add a little bit of this to it too. So again, because the idea was let's make it the best wine for the market, and then you slap Chateau Margaux on it, and the consumer basically, but you also put the merchant's name. So it would be Johnston's Margaux. And we still see that actually the Johnston's, Nathaniel Johnston et Fils in Bordeaux still has this wonderful collection of tickets, wine bottle tickets. And again, their blend of Chateau Margaux, and that seems strange too, their blend of Chateau Margaux was actually slightly different than another merchant's blend of Chateau Margaux. And that's why, for example, in Dublin, Sneed, Barton and French, which was a merchant on Sackville Street, now known as O'Connell Street, was famous for the quality of its wine because their blending ability at that last stage was apparently phenomenal. In fact, Robert Peel, having been Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, goes back to England. He continues to patronize Sneed, Barton and French. And Clara can talk a little bit, she talks a little bit about in some of her previous talks, Tara, excuse me, that I've listened to. And Sneed, Barton, and French, their claret is known throughout the British Empire. This is a Dublin claret. So it's almost that Dublin is getting as much credit, and the merchants, as Bordeaux itself in that sense. So that's one way to answer that question. But yes, aging has changed over time. There's also the, I guess I was talking to Andy Bielenberg earlier about, as part of that rebranding of Bordeaux in the 19th century of putting chateau as a way to ennoble the wine, you also begin to see the importance of, much greater importance of putting wine downstairs and aging it, because that becomes, and port really benefits from this because it ages for a really long time. If you can pull out a bottle at a table, 50-year-old bottle of port. If I go, look, a 1966 bottle of port, you'll go, wow, there's been some money in that family for some time. I mean, just the ability to invest in a product, put it in a cellar, have that not increase unless you're going to resell it. It essentially doesn't have, it's not a huge return on your investment, except for its aesthetic ability to become a better wine. The notion, again, of prioritizing aesthetics over money, that is a class power play. And it's remarkable what that does. When you say, I got money, and I've had money. And that takes me way back. So aging is also, that becomes part of the 19th century equation of wines too. But technology improves, you can age wines more. And that's a problem that Bordeaux and at the high levels faces right now, along with his reputation of being snooty and aristocratic. It's tough to sell a product to a broad base and say, yeah, oh, here, I want you to spend €80 on this now. I'm saying, nice quality Bordeaux, but I don't want you to drink it for 20 years. What? In a modern market, people look at you and go, I got 80, for €80, I'd rather get 2 bottles of things I can drink in the next month. So it's a conundrum for them.
Thanks very much, Simon. Just a quick one. Whatever about the Lawton family, possible links to the area, as Willie mentioned, there are quite a few McCarthy families who might be hoping for a link to Chateau McCarthy. And just wondering, have you a good book to recommend?
More about the McCarthys?
Yeah.
Well, as I said, they came over, Dennis McCarthy came over from Clonmel in 1748. In his request to stay in 1756, when the French government says, no, everybody's got to go. All the subjects of the British king have to go. He claims at that point he's a Jacobite. It's kind of weird in 1756, because he came over in 1748. Jacobites had basically become a non-issue for the most part by the spring of 1746 after the Battle of Culloden. So, there was still some scare, but they didn't really scare people in the way and there really wasn't much of a following because everybody knew that Bonnie Prince Charlie by this point was a drunk in Rome. You didn't really want to hitch your wagon to that guy. But it played well with French officials. But again, what was intriguing about him is he married an Irish woman. They were actually married before they went over. They went over together. As I said, they had a daughter who was educated at a convent. I found her records. There was no record of them having any children. And people said, no, they were childless. And I found this record of the convent saying, no, they had a daughter. But she died at 20. And I suspect her role would have been to marry her to a either wealthy fellow Irishman or a wealthy Frenchman. In any event, the sons did quite well, although one of them didn't do well in the Revolution. And they continued in business up through the 1820s. And the name continued really up until 1930 when they finally died. But yeah, there are other branches of the McCarthy family in Toulouse. There's a branch of the McCarthy family where one had a magnificent library, and so broadly speaking, McCarthys did well for themselves over in France.
Fantastic. Thank you to Flor McCarthy for that question.
Thank you, Chad. And perhaps another round of applause for a really fantastic. Well, Simon and I have a few thanks to give at the end of the festival, so if you'll bear with us. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, and it's a very appropriate final slide on the screen, I think. I'd never imagined that I would associate claret with effervescence, but I will now.
Or indeed with race science.
Or indeed with race science. So yes, we wanted to thank all of you for coming, and we have a number of thank yous that it's worth making. Maybe the first one, and he's been referred to a couple of times. He's the spirit in some ways that hangs over a lot of this, along with a number of other key guides and advisors like John Horn. But Roy Foster, who couldn't be here today, he's the president of the West Cork History Festival. He has been an endless source of advice, and so I hope you'll indulge us in thanking him for encouraging us and being a great connector to all sorts of people, including Chad.
You don't have to clap after each one. It's not like the Oscars, don't worry. Just a few other people to thank. Our fantastic volunteers, Finola and Robert, who've been manning the ticket desk all weekend. Simon's mum, Gillian, who's also been helping out. Finola and Robert also ran our field trips, which have been a real inspiration for a lot of people.
I think we should clap that one.
We talked a bit at this festival about how we try not just to sit in a tent and listen to lectures, although that's fantastic. We also try to do history through music and through exploration of the countryside. And Finola and Robert have run some field trips. We've had a historical sea kayaking this afternoon, which must have been quite wet in all ways. And there's also a fantastic organisation, company called Gormu, who run walking tours and swims and talk a lot. And Connor's just here, so thank you, Connor. Which I highly recommend if you haven't ever been on one of their tours, because they're fantastic.
We should also, I think, thank those who have victualled you in the course of the weekend. And in particular, Helen, I think, is the coffee lady, is an amazing, heroic figure. But also John from the Shebeen, who will give you a last pint if you're not amongst the group who are going to the wine tasting, because, as you know, the wine tasting did sell out quite quickly. So those of you who got tickets for that will know who you are, and we will go to that. But those of you who are not in that group because of the limit of supply can benefit from John's hospitality here. And we'd also like to thank Sean and his team, who have done the AV work so well. And I think we should also thank Paul and Georgie. I don't think Paul is here, but I don't see Georgie just at the moment. But the Keens, who own Inishbeg, have been incredibly flexible in their arrangements. They have acceded to all sorts of odd requests, and they've made what was for us a post-pandemic experiment in being in a new place, I think, really fun, really worthwhile, and I hope we can talk about doing it again. So thank you as well. And then just finally at the back, Cathal O'Donovan and William Casey, thank you for providing us with a range of publications, both by speakers and contributors and by others. We're really grateful to you for being willing to come and do that. Both history lovers in Skibbereen. So thank you very much indeed. Anyone else who's been neglected, it's not lack of love, it's just exhaustion. But I think we should probably say something about logistics from here.
Yes, if you're going to the wine tasting, basically you walk up back to the house towards the car park the way you came. And they'll be signposted from the house. It's actually in the conservatory, which is attached to the house, so it's just round the side. If you aren't going to the wine tasting, and sorry to make it divided like that, as Simon said, the bar will remain open. I think the coffee lady might be going home, so if you want a coffee, grab that quickly. But thank you again for coming and all your warm encouragement, and we really couldn't do it without our audience, so thanks very much.